Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're really delighted to be hosting Daniel Stashower this evening. He's here to talk about his new book, American Demon, Eliot Ness and the Hunt for America's Jack the Ripper. So, most people, when they hear the name Eliot Ness, think of his time as a prohibition agent in Chicago when he helped bring down Al Capone. Those prohibition-era exploits became legendary thanks to the exaggerated memoir, The Untouchables, which was published in the 1950s, and later the popular TV series and then the movie. But Ness was just 28 years old when his career in Chicago ended, as Dan notes at the beginning of his book. And a couple of years later, Ness landed in Cleveland as the director of public safety, the youngest safety director in the history of any large city. And that's where Dan picks up the story, and what a story it is. Because during Ness's time in Cleveland, the city experienced a string of brutal murders, each victim beheaded, with remains in most cases dismembered and scattered across the city. The murderer was dubbed the torso killer, or the mad butcher of Kingsbury Run. These serial Depression-era murders were never solved. There were about a dozen of them. Dan provides an engaging and suspenseful account of how they were investigated and feverishly covered by the media of the day, and how they confounded one of America's most celebrated law enforcement officers, Eliot Ness, who preferred initially to focus on his own efforts to reform and modernize the Cleveland police force before eventually getting drawn into searching unsuccessfully for the killer. In composing this true crime thriller about the iconic lawman and the notorious madman, Dan brings to the task a fine reputation as a mystery writer, a biographer of Arthur Conan Doyle, and a narrative historian. He's won multiple Edgar, Agatha, and Anthony Awards, which are the top prizes in the field of mystery writing. He's also developed a sort of pattern with some of his nonfiction work, building the books around a famous historical figure and a crime. The Beautiful Cigar Girl featured Edgar Allan Poe and the murder in New York of an attractive tobacco store clerk. The Hour of Peril told the story of the detective Alan Pinkerton and an assassination plot against Abraham Lincoln in 1861, just before Lincoln's inauguration. An American Demon, of course, also has a prominent figure and a gruesome series of crimes. And if you have any other stories that sort of fit that pattern, Dan is looking for the subject of his next book. He was just mentioning that before. Anyway, as far as American Demon goes, Kirkus called it riveting and illuminating, and Publishers Weekly commends the book's nuanced and layered portrayal of the flawed Eliot Ness. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dan Stashower.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for being here on a Friday night. Can you hear me? Excellent. So, I have here a box. What's in the box? Well, it's the worst board game ever created. Worse even than the Sink the Titanic board game, in which you are invited to compete for a seat on one of the lifeboats. Worse even than Capital Punishment, the board game, in which the game pieces are a noose, a rifle, and a tiny electric chair. Ladies and gentlemen, Eliot Ness and the Untouchables, the game. And here's Walter Winchell to tell us how it's played. There are 24 plastic gun markers and 24 gun cards. The player who rounds up the most gun cards at the end of play is the winner. In other words, the player who gets the most guns wins. This game came out in 1961, and it was just a small corner of the merchandising around Eliot Ness and the Untouchables. There were also Eliot Ness trading cards, Eliot Ness action figures, Eliot Ness chewing gum, untouchable flavor in every stick. Now this is the part where I'm supposed to say, let me tell you about the real Eliot Ness. But in many ways, that is who he was. He's the board game chewing gum action figure guy. He's a man of great integrity and astonishing bravery. He rose to fame, as Bradley mentioned, during the Prohibition years as the man who got Al Capone. He's remembered today, of course, as the leader of the Untouchables, an absolutely legendary team of Prohibition agents. When people think of Eliot Ness, the first thing they think of is a big truck smashing through the doors of a brewery. But wait, there's more. Eliot Ness was also a very forward-thinking reformer who wanted to pull law enforcement up out of the era of brass knuckles, leather truncheons, and the third degree. Yes, he was astonishingly brave. But on screen, his exploits were spectacular, but he attacks every problem with violence. And in real life, he didn't care much for violence. And by the time he became top dog in Cleveland, he rarely even carried a gun. He once told a friend he didn't need it. The holster was enough. And he brought off some of his most heroic, most spectacular moments with that empty holster. But wait, I hear you say, Cleveland? Did you just say Cleveland? Why, yes, I did. We think of Eliot Ness as a Chicago guy. Wrigley Field, Da Bears, Eliot Ness. Chicago is where all the drama with Capone played out, but that chapter of Ness's career was brief, and it was pretty much all wrapped up by the time he was 30. So what does he do for a second act? What else? He moves to Cleveland. And why not? A newly elected, reform-minded mayor hired Ness to serve as director of public safety. This is a position that put him in charge of the police department and the fire department and a whole lot more. This was a big, big promotion. He's gone from street level to a corner office in City Hall. A lot of people assumed he would fall flat on his face. What's more, he's the youngest person ever to hold the position. His marching orders are to clean up a police department that was basically rotting from the inside out because of corruption, and also, by the way, to break the stranglehold that the mob had over the city. So, no big deal. Clean up the police department, take down the mob, break for lunch. And the wonder of it all is the degree to which he succeeded, translating the lessons of Capone into real and lasting change. His timing was terrific, and one of his reporter friends said, "The city seldom had needed a hero so badly." Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is all great, but I came here tonight hoping to hear about gruesome dismemberments. Well, your moment has arrived. Actually, the murders began before Ness took office and continued on his watch. These murders, which eventually came to be grouped under the title Kingsbury Run, were absolutely horrific. Each of the victims had been beheaded, some it seemed while still alive, and the remains, in most cases, were painstakingly dismembered and scattered throughout the city. So, picture it. A pair of schoolboys would stumble across a headless torso, or a hacked-off section of an arm or a leg would be spotted floating down the Cuyahoga River, or a severed head would pop up in a tin can at a city dump. Worst scavenger hunt ever. Each atrocity touched off a cycle of fear, outrage, and calls for action. With thunderous headlines, "The Mad Butcher Strikes Again. Who is this mad torso killer?" And the victims, when they could be identified at all, were found to be indigents, drifters, or small-time criminals. People, in the phrase of the day, people who would not be missed. Worse yet, the crimes overlapped with the 50th anniversary of Jack the Ripper's crimes in London. And a lot of the coverage of the American crimes drew explicit parallels to the Ripper, not only to the crimes themselves, but also to the climate of fear that surrounded them. As one national headline put it, "Cleveland's torso killer slays in same manner as Jack the Ripper." And you'll be surprised to hear that only served to raise the volume on the story and turn it into a national dilemma. Here's how a reporter summed it up as the death toll continued to climb. 10 times in Cleveland, a mad headsman has killed, and 10 times he has dissected his victim with consummate skill. 10 times, indicating skill at surgery or efficiency at butchery, he has baffled police so completely that today there is no tangible clue to the killer. What is he like, this ghoul who delights in cutting up the bodies of men and women, leaving arms and legs and heads and torsos to be found by small boys, bridge watchmen, and chance passers-by? Well, it didn't stop at 10. So, we've got a killer on the loose. We've got Eliot Ness in City Hall, the city's top cop. So here we go, right? The Eliot Ness from television would have strapped on his gun and started kicking down doors. But the real Eliot Ness is a different guy. And it's important to point out that catching killers was not his job. It wasn't what he had been hired to do. He wasn't a homicide detective any more than he was a fireman or a crossing guard. He was the director of public safety. The chief of police reported to him. He was at the top of the pyramid. Nobody expected the director of public safety to pound the pavement any more than they expected him to rescue cats stranded in trees. But this is Eliot Ness we're talking about. People did expect action. They expected heroics. Ness had made a point of saying he would lead from the front lines. And over time, as the pattern of these crimes gathered force, he had to step in. He said, "I'm going to do all I can to aid in the investigation. I want to see this psycho caught." So, I can hear what you're thinking. You're thinking, this is all so terribly interesting, and I can't wait to read the book. But I wonder if Dan stumbled across some surprising personal family connection while doing his research. Why, yes. Yes, I did, and thank you for asking. I spent a lot of time looking through Eliot Ness's papers and family scrapbooks, and as you would expect, there are a lot of familiar names and faces. There are newspaper clippings with Al Capone and other gangsters, and there are also some of the era's other shining lights, like FDR, John D. Rockefeller, and J. Edgar Hoover. So I'm paging through, and suddenly a face jumps out at me, and it was my grandfather, Fred P. Stashower. You know, I thought it must be a mistake. I thought, surely I have fallen asleep. It's happened before. I'd love to be able to tell you that my grandfather, Fred P. Stashower, was a bootlegger or a bank robber or a dark horse candidate to be the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. No such luck. And at this point, he opened the book and began to read in a pleasing baritone voice. There are some for whom the name Fred Stashower will not be familiar. Even for me, his grandson, it came as a surprise to find him mentioned several times in Ness's scrapbooks. Many questions sprang to mind. In 1935, the year that Ness became Director of Public Safety, Fred P. Stashower was a rising young admin. I knew him years later as a genial, pipe-smoking figure in a powder blue sport coat. A typical day in his company began with an improving lecture at the Rofant Club, a venerable bibliographic society, and finished on the 50-yard line of the old municipal stadium, commiserating over yet another losing effort from the Browns. He contained multitudes. Wherever he went, some local politician, broadcaster, or sports figure would be sure to cross the room and say hello. Fred greeted them all the same way. "You're the last of the good guys," he would say. Then, still gripping the guy's hand, he'd tip a wink to anybody who happened to be standing nearby. "But," he would add, "I could tell you stories." He seemed to know everyone. But even so, it took some digging to figure out how he came to be enshrined in Eliot Ness's scrapbooks. Ness and my grandfather, it seems, crossed paths at least once a year at an event called the Anvil Review. This was a raucous political roast, staged by amateur performers from the City Club, an otherwise sober-minded group of leading businessmen. It was modeled along the lines of the White House Correspondents' Dinner or the Gridiron Club. My grandfather, it appears, was a perennial cast member, and Ness was a frequent target of their japes and jibes, one of the goats, as they were known. One year, a City Club actor took the stage wearing a child's Buster Brown uniform with short pants and a Peter Pan collar to parody Ness's youth and gee-whiz enthusiasm. "I'm the youngest safety director in the United States," he exclaimed. "The man who got Al Capone single-handed. I'd like to tell you in a few words how to rid the country of crime and corruption, jaundice, pyorrhea, toothache, and body odor." Ness took it all in stride, apparently. He pasted a caricature of the actors involved into his scrapbook, including Fred, along with an audience photo of himself with his hand pressed to his forehead, all but doubled over in appreciation of the joke. I knew my grandfather for 34 years, and he never mentioned any of this. He never mentioned his celebrated turn as FDR, complete with an ivory cigarette holder, or the year that he had to go on with his arm in a sling, having broken his elbow playing basketball, or even the year he was branded that old egg-tossing vandal following a prank at City Club headquarters. In fact, I don't recall that he ever mentioned Eliot Ness by name, but I'm guessing that they knew each other well enough to cross the room and say hello. They were the same age, and I know for a fact they frequented many of the same watering holes. One of these places was a tavern called Fagin's, said to have been a speakeasy during the Prohibition era. Fagin's still had a shot and a beer vibe when I went there with my grandfather in his later years. There was sawdust on the floor and pickled eggs on the bar, and Fred's drink would be on the table by the time he sat down, after exchanging pleasantries with all and sundry. He drank Canadian whiskey on the rocks, and it occurs to me now that for a man born in 1902, who came of age during Prohibition, this was the good stuff. It came across Lake Erie, straight from Canada, unadulterated, as opposed to the local brown hooch and needle beer. My grandmother Hildegard, being a woman of more refined tastes, took hers with a splash. Fagin's closed a while back, but these days you can still get a nice glass of Eliot Ness Amber Lager at the brew pub of the Great Lakes Brewery just across the river. The dark wood behind the bar is pocked with bullet holes where, according to legend, Ness once exchanged fire with local hoods. This is not true, and no one ever really believed it in the first place, but the story persists, as stories about Ness seem to do. Even now, however, the hunt for the Kingsbury Run killer stands apart from the other stories. He was that almost unknown creature, a master criminal, one expert would observe. it can be argued powerfully that he was the greatest murderer of all time. More than 80 years later, the debate over the Mad Butcher and his reign of terror still rages, both in print and over drinks in bullet-pocked saloons. The story also forms a largely undisclosed chapter in the enigmatic saga of Eliot Ness, a grim counterpoint to his camera-ready exploits with the Untouchables, pitting a newly minted American hero against a blood-crazed demon who struck in the shadows. One of these days, wrote reporter Bud Silverman in 1961, before a new generation of Americans becomes indoctrinated with the untouchable version of the life and works of the late Eliot Ness, somebody ought to sit down at his typewriter and describe the man as Cleveland knew him. By almost any measurement, Ness was quite a guy, but he was not the gun-blazing, fist-swinging raider the romantics of the airways are now portraying him. He was quite a guy. That much is true. You might even say he was the last of the good guys. But I could tell you stories. Thank you. And thank you for coming out. And I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have. Not to put you on the spot.
If you have a question,
Sir. Oh,
could you please step up to this mic here because we're videoing.
Hi there, Dan. I'm a big fan.
oh, hey, nice to see you. Michael,
Anyway,
my cousin.
Yes. He paid me to say that. Did you get into trying to solve the murders? Did they use like the modern investigative techniques, or is that
You know, that's a great question, almost as if we discussed it ahead of time. One of the things that was so impressive about this is the incredible effort that the Cleveland police put forward to try and solve this crime. It took a while before they realized that they were dealing with a series of interconnected crimes. It took a while because, for all kinds of reasons, but when one body was discovered just a few hundred yards from where two others had been discovered a few months before, the police realized they were dealing with a series of crimes. The whole thing snapped into focus, and one of the investigators said, "We are on the hunt of a crazed killer with a taste for blood." But it's early days. Forensics are not what we understand them to be today, but what's impressive is how the investigators, Ness included, tried to push through the limits of the time, improvising techniques as they went along. The coroner pulled together a panel of experts. They were trying to produce what they called a synthetic portrait of the killer. Today we would understand that as criminal profiling. There was another case where they're going after a particular suspect. They can't find a picture of him. Oh, one turns up, he's 12 years old. Not a lot of help. So what do? They project it onto a scrim of canvas, and a local artist, using descriptions from witnesses, sort of embellishes it to produce an approximation of what he looked like at the present time. What today we would understand as age progression software. Again and again and again, the investigators did everything they could to overcome the limits and push forward. I thank you, sir, to whom I am related.
Looking forward to the book.
Sir.
Now the case or the murders ended. They never caught whoever it was that did it. Was there after that, did another city have an outbreak of something similar? Could this individual have moved? Do you know anything about that?
The answers are both yes and also no. The murders in Cleveland did come to a close, although for years afterwards, whenever a crime surfaced that was in any way similar, people wondered had the killer returned. But throughout the series of crimes in Cleveland and afterwards, there were many who believed that the killer was moving back and forth, perhaps by rail, between Cleveland and other cities, especially nearby Pennsylvania, where a series of similar crimes were discovered both at the time and subsequently. There are a lot of people who feel the killer never stopped. He simply moved on to greener pastures, which calls to mind how I came to the story in the first place. I was 8 or 9 years old, growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm at summer camp. We're having an overnight, and the camp counselor decides it would be a fine idea to tell us a ghost story around the fire while we're toasting our s'mores about the torso killer, the mad butcher of Kingsbury Run. And I remember at one point we had to stop so that he could explain to us what the word decapitated meant. And the phrase, "and the killer is still out there," was repeated over and over and over again. Nobody slept much that night, and 50 or so years later, here we are. Anyone else? I'm looking at Jack because I suspect. Go ahead.
Could you discuss Ness's decision to burn down the hobo shacks?
Yeah, that wasn't Ness's decision to. With each crime, the calls for action grew louder and louder. As one of the investigators said, Ness had to do something. The mayor was on his neck. It was getting to be a national disgrace, this uncaught killer. So there's this gloomy thread of land running through the center of town, a dried up ancient riverbed called Kingsbury Run. And over the course of the Depression, it had become home to a series of shanty towns and homeless encampments. And it was believed that the killer, for the most part, was preying on these victims, these people who would be hard to identify, people who wouldn't be missed. Ness got the idea, under cover of darkness, of leading a team of raiders into Kingsbury Run, knocking on doors, rousting the inhabitants, looking for evidence, hoping to surprise the killer in the act, perhaps. But he was accused at the time and afterwards of what I guess today we would file under police brutality, or it's a debatable point. But what the evening ended with Ness setting fire to the encampments in Kingsbury Run. The city did not care for it. It was felt that putting these people out of their miserable homes, their miserable tar paper shacks, cardboard dwellings, tin and temporary dwellings, while the killer roamed free, that maybe there was a better way of going about this problem. One editorial was headed "Misguided Zeal." And particular attention was paid to the fact that Ness had taken fingerprints of all the men rounded up that night, in case in the future one of them should fall prey to the killer. And it was thought maybe more, tracking down the killer instead of arming ourselves against a future assault. I can argue either side of this equation. Ness was doing his best, responding to a great deal of pressure. These were uncharted territories, but this burning of Kingsbury Run, which left a cloud of smoke over the city that lingered for days, was not his finest hour, and some people feel the beginning of the end of his time in Cleveland. Thank you. That was more than you wanted to know, I'm aware.
So two questions. Could you first sort of describe the kind of archive that exists for an unsolved series of murders like this, and what do you find now so many years later? And secondly, did you go into this, or was there ever a point where you thought, I can solve this?
I think everybody who does, as you know as well as anyone, this is a very popular genre, especially now. And I think everybody who writes about true crime hopes that they're going to stumble across some letter underneath a carpet on a stair tread, or something that unlocks the whole thing years later. This one, for my purposes, it was enough that Ness had a suspect. Ness ran the suspect to ground. The killings did stop. Ness believed he had done his job. People are going to argue until the end of time. This is Cleveland's version of the grassy knoll or Jack the Ripper. People are going to argue till the end of time about what the real circumstances were, and particularly whether Dr. X, Ness's suspect, was the guy. For my purposes, the fact that Ness had a suspect, tangled with the suspect, and resolved it to his own satisfaction was my ending. That was how I was able to land the plane. But I spent a lot of time, I mean a whole lot of time, running down blind alleys, and probably some of the same blind alleys that investigators at the time did. That one of the few victims who was identified was a woman named Florence Polillo. There were names in her found and written down in her room. The police did their best to run those names down, but I thought, surely with the internet, they didn't have the internet. Surely with the I spent a lot of time running these names on the internet, and sometimes tantalizing things would come up. So yeah, I mean, I've fallen prey to that temptation as much as anyone, but I always knew it was wishful thinking.
And what does the archive look like? I mean, is it boxes
Well,
and boxes?
it varies from case to case. I mean, with my previous one, there were the Pinkerton archives down at the Library of Congress. Turns out there have been one or two books written about this Abraham Lincoln, who was also involved in the story, and so there was a lot there to go through. This one, a lot of it was Ness's own papers, but also these wonderful, wonderful newspapers of the time, where you just could grab onto something and follow it over the course of 3-4 years. See how these things developed, how the police would latch on to something and run with it. And it was written about very, very extensively. Unfortunately, the original police records, the original files, a lot of that stuff has not survived. I mean, it's 90 years later, and there are still, for those of you planning to visit Cleveland and go to the Rock Hall, perhaps you can visit the Cleveland Police Museum, where death masks of the victims are still on display to this day. There are things.
Is that actually your board game from when you were a kid?
It is, and I'll be happy to break it open. It's not very good, but yes, and eBay is a wonderful thing.
Dan, you had mentioned early profiling, but I was wondering, with Ness being a former T-man, did he call on federal resources? Did he call on resources from other cities in his process? I was just wondering about that.
Yes, thank you. They certainly did reach out to other cities, and they certainly did try to cross-pollinate with other agencies. The one I'm thinking of particularly, the one that springs to mind, one of the victims was called the Tattooed Man. You'll never guess why he was called that. He had a lot of tattoos. He had this bewildering collection of tattoos, including cartoon characters, Popeye the Sailor Man, lots of initials, all sorts of things that were as distinctive as you could possibly imagine. And they had his head. So they went about this in several ways, but one way was to reach out to tattoo parlors all across the country, because surely these 8 tattoos, 7 or 8 tattoos in this particular combination couldn't be that. There can't be that many people
Right.
running around with these tattoos. And the other thing they did was they cleaned up his head, they put it on a gurney, and they displayed it to the public in the morgue. So, if you'd been in Cleveland in the 1930s and you were of a mind to, and you wanted to get in line outside the morgue and file past this body, that also was available to you, which is a roundabout way of answering your original question. Thank you, Beth Foxwell. Wait, is that time for one more question from? Would you like to ask a question, young Jack Stashower?
Dad? All right, I am genuinely curious. You've never really talked about Cleveland in any of your writing, but what was it like finally bringing Cleveland into your professional career?
What another great question, and you know, almost as if we talked about that in the car.
I had a whole thing lined up. It didn't feel right.
The whole shtick?
The whole
Yeah,
shtick.
some of you will remember Jack from the last time we were here when he was this tall. He's now that tall, and I don't care for it. It was fun. As Jack is painfully aware, you can take the boy out of Cleveland, but he still roots for the Browns. And Jack was with me every step of the way through the 0-16 season. And I think it speaks very well of him and very poorly of me that I've subjected him to this and turned him into to a Cleveland fan. But one of the things that was so interesting to me, although as you know I'm older than the hills, I wasn't around in the 1930s when these crimes were taking place. I grew up in the era where the Cuyahoga River caught fire and the city became a national punchline. You know, a lot of you will remember this. The mistake on the lake, burn on, crazy river, burn on. Well, I'm going through the newspapers from the 1930s, and sure enough, the Cuyahoga River catches fire, and there's billowing smoke, and it's in the papers. And I liked seeing the way the city responded to it in the 30s, which was very, very different from the way they responded in the 60s. The response seemed to be, yeah, you know, we're a city on the move. There's a lot of industry here. Every once in a while, the river's going to catch fire. You know, so don't worry about it. We'll clean it up. Nothing to see here. Move along. And the Cleveland News ran a headline suggesting that maybe this ought to be referred to Ripley's Believe It or Not. And they suggested a headline, "Oh, Mr. Ripley, our river's on fire." And nobody was suggesting that it was a good idea to set fire to the river, but I kind of liked the way in the 30s the city doubled down on it. That's the Cleveland I really enjoyed getting to know while working on this book. With that, I will leave you, but I am happy to sign your books, and once again, thank you so much for coming out on a Friday night.